Dominique and I did a lit review on inter-organizational trust. My research question was towards a deeper understanding of inter-organizational trust, definitions, governance mechanisms, measurement, benefit applications. Well, that's all. I actually looked at interpersonal very, very quickly in terms of boundary spanners as an agent of the organization, and also just a tiny bit on what is organizational trust to be able to differentiate it. Do not try this at home. Don't do it. It is much, much too broad. The initial plan was to start with 6 fields of research. I was going to look at psychology, sociology, economics, marketing, strategic management, and business ethics. So when I decided that was too broad, we narrowed it down and we dropped sociology, which is really kind of the firm in the broader social context, and we dropped the psychology, which is an individual's propensity to trust and what that means for the organization. I really wanted to look at what the firm can do, because at this point in history, there's a massive crisis of trust of individuals towards governments, individuals towards media, individuals towards businesses. So you think of the Bernie Madoffs and the Enrons, you think of companies like Nortel that suddenly shut down and people have no pensions. There's a lot of distrust out there. Now that's individual trust. So I wanted to look at what governance mechanisms, what can a firm do in terms of process to facilitate trust? Because we know that inter-organizational trust, the collective trust between 2 organizations, not I work with this company and I like that person, I like that boundary spanner, but collectively, if you were to ask the CEO, the people in accounting, the people in marketing, or the people in purchasing, how do they collectively feel about this other firm that they work with? Do they trust them? That is a different thing than interpersonal trust between boundary spanners, and it's been found by Zahir, McKeebley, and Perrone in 1998 that inter-organizational trust is a completely separate concept, and also that it has more effect and a more positive effect on performance. So, what if your organization could not trust its partners tomorrow? So think about that for just a second, because bring it back to your personal level. If you wake up in the morning and you can't trust that the person's going to stop at the stop sign, that the mechanic fixed the brakes in your car, then you have 3 choices. You can completely shut down and be completely paralyzed because nothing in the world works. You can try to control everything, except you never can. Or you can decide to trust that the guy's going to stop at the stoplight and that the mechanic fixed your brakes. And it's similar in your organization. If you have a crisis of trust between your organization and a partner organization, you'll miss out on these benefits. And there are 2 types of benefits. I won't go through all of these. I wanted to give you a sample. There are cost and performance benefits to inter-organizational trust and relational benefits. And by cost and performance, I mean that when you can trust a business or a partner organization, you spend less resource time negotiating your contracts, you spend less resource time working out conflict, you spend less resource time, or you have more product innovation performance because there's a freer flow of ideas and you can innovate and create value. People aren't constrained by a lot of hierarchy and monitoring and suspicion. So to Susan's point, when there's a positive feeling towards a partner organization, there's a virtuous cycle of creating positive outcomes. And on a relational perspective, the benefits are more joint action, more commitment, more information from a partner's network, so people will freely give. What I found most interesting as well is trust is insanely complex in terms of a construct, and I'll get to that in a second, but the very complexity of trust between 2 organizations, they're passed through history, all those webs of relations from the C-suite to the delivery truck driver, all of that, that is part of your competitive advantage, because a competitor couldn't replicate that, and a competitor wouldn't have the same kind of trusting relationship. So you would have a cost advantage, and you would have a competitive advantage as well. So it's a good thing, this trust. So I said trust is a very insane concept. It's everywhere. It's called the glue of society, the lubricant of business, and yet for 20 years, researchers have not been able to nail down one construct. Castaldo et al., they did a lit review and they looked at 50 years of definitions of trust and they found 90 different ones. So we know a lot more what it does than what it is. There's no single definition. The unit of measurement is very complex. Because trust grows, because trust has a feedback loop, so every time we have an interaction, I take that information back to my organization. It gets fed into that big, complicated system of who trusts whom. It also changes. There are different types of trust. So we may start on a very thin kind of institutional trust. I know Dawn has accreditation, I know she has a big storefront location, I know she has these results. And then that will grow if we work on a project together. And then suddenly I'm thinking, we are on this project together, we are in a joint venture, and suddenly I have a much stronger identification trust. So trust changes. In my paper I wrote, it's like quicksilver. When you think you have it all figured out, it morphs into something completely different. And what we find, there was a question earlier about what kind of empirical research there is. There's actually little empirical research on interorganizational trust. There's almost no replication of what exists. There's very little longitudinal. I looked at 100 articles in the 4 disciplines, and the longest longitudinal study that I found was 12 months, which is not longitudinal at all for a construct that builds and changes and evolves over time. So we have all these notions of trust, and yet the structure and the empirical data that supports it is a little bit weak. Also very little cross-functional research. So the ethicists come at it one way, the marketing people come at it another way. The economists look at it entirely from the point of view of cost and avoiding opportunism. I love this quote. You don't have to read it all, but I love this notion that to study trust is to ride the organizational elevator up and down a variety of conceptual levels. And I think of it like Willy Wonka's elevator. Crazy elevator. Because in my description on the website, I said I would give you guys a definition of trust. If you boil it down, there's all kinds of different versions of what this means, what this means. You must have these 2 elements to constitute interorganizational trust. Otherwise, it's cooperation, it's something else, it's confidence or faith. But for trust, you need an assessment, you need a calculation, a rational calculation. Can I trust this person? Can they deliver as an organization? And you also need an assessment of their morality. Will they put my needs first? Will they consider my outcomes as well? Those 2 pieces are critical to trust. So I looked at governance mechanisms, okay? Because when you have interorganizational relations, you must have some kind of understanding of, oh, I got trouble then. You have to have some kind of understanding of what structure it's going to be. Is there an equity partnership? Is there a big contract? So there's formal governance. You're looking at stuff like hierarchy and monitoring. The most important piece here is the intent has to be very positive. If you are looking at at hierarchy and monitoring to control the other person, you will breed distrust because the other person will feel controlled. It's the same thing with contracts. Very detailed contracts are going to limit the opportunity of people to do their best. They signal distrust. And so what you want to do, and companies like McDonald's and Warren Buffett do it all the time, very simple contracts. They trust that the parties involved are going to really maximize the outcomes. And transaction-specific investments. This was a really new one for me. I got kind of lost in the business literature. But transaction-specific investments signal a long-term commitment. You and I are going to market a product together, so I'm going to produce materials for your store that's going to highlight this great product, and it's going to work out for both of us. It can be a building. It can be specific training. So it can be tangible or intangible, and this one, all the literature agrees, is really critical to building trust between organizations. You can also have 2 kinds of informal governance mechanisms. Direct experience, which means agents within the organization have worked together, and those are relational governance mechanisms. These are also sometimes called governance by trust. In a really high trust organization, sometimes they do away with any kind of formal mechanism, which if you think the trust thing's all a little airy-fairy and loosey-goosey, has huge cost and competitive advantages. Common norms and values, as you've seen, really help people to give their all, really help to focus things, and help organizations trust. Goal congruence is critical, and actually, if you are negotiating goal congruence in your contracts, in that contracting process, that can build trust as well. Joint planning, joint problem solving, those two pieces, if they are done as a process, really build trust between two organizations, because they have to work things out. They have to plan together. There's elements in joint planning of distributive justice, so how are we going to share the profits? There are pieces of the other kind of justice that escapes me at the moment. And bilateral communications. You can't do any of this if you're not communicating. Bilateral communications can take place here in the formal mechanism unless you're demanding information, right? If you are fostering exchange of information, then the benefits there are huge as well. Right? So all of these build on one another. You need bilateral communications for joint problem solving. That fosters trust, and trust increases the amount of communication that happens. So there's a positive, virtuous cycle. Indirect experience is what we know of as reputation. Your networks, particularly business networks, if you belong to a trade association or a guild, that is like a third-party validation of your reputation. And it is a huge source of trust as well, because people will take the shortcut. Rather than go and check all of your credentials, they'll check with other members in your network. Yeah, perfect segue. Thanks, Kate. She's tough, eh? I have been slicing and dicing my MRP for my blog, and if you want to find out more about the 22 benefits of trust, then you're welcome to check it out. And that's at accolade-communications.wordpress.com. So there's a lot more detail on the governance mechanisms there if that is something that interests you. And it's also something that you can do with your MRP. Control B, is that what you said? Just B. Just B. Any questions? You know I could do this all day. Any questions? Yeah?
If you had to identify some behaviors that leaders need to exhibit in order to create more trust between these organizations, partner organizations, is there a 20% that gives you 80% of your trust? Are there a vital few behaviors in the research? Or?
Yeah, so you raise an interesting question, because trust can be a behavior, an expectation, a decision. Trust can be a lot of those things. And I wasn't looking at the behavior of one person. I wanted to look at the whole organization. There's a lot of research on what one person can do, right, with their team to foster trust. I would tell you, based on my research, the most important thing a leader can do is to put in the right structures that support trust, because it signals this is the behavior that we expect. It rewards it in the compensation systems, in the way that it requires bilateral communication. It sets out what the parameters are for contracting. So you could have the most trustworthy manager and teams that are trusting, but pure rot between organizations. So I would say for a leader, it's important to make sure that the right structures are in place. Because there's a lot of, I won't say light stuff on trust, but there's a lot of the interpersonal stuff. And the whole point of interorganizational trust is that we need some macro structures to fight the macro problem of distrust in society. Yeah.
Did you work with Dominique?
I worked with Romina Dalla in the CME.
Dominique, do you think it can be applied globally, or do you think it's structured for just North America?
No, I do think it can apply globally. And what I didn't say when I was talking about how trust is complex, trust also changes based on culture. So research done in 1998 by Seiko showed that Japan, for instance, was a very, very high trust culture, right? So interorganizational trust, they conceptualize trust more broadly. So I think a good leader should know what those different levers are. I'd love to see longitudinal research to see what has happened in Japan since '98, because the Edelman Trust Barometer that came out, that's not empirical, but it's this worldwide study of trust, shows that trust has tanked in Japan after the Fukushima reactor explosion. So we don't have any research that tells us, well, and if you find it, I'd love to see it. We don't know what impacts, what big historical events do to impact interorganizational trust. So I think it can apply. Major challenges in terms of communication, because that bilateral communication piece, you do need a common language. Yeah. Terrific. Thank you.